The morning sun cast long shadows across the Los Angeles Police Department's parking lot as a black Honda Civic pulled into an unmarked spot. Behind the wheel sat Detective James Carter, freshly arrived from Chicago with 15 years of decorated service under his belt. His new gold captain's badge sat heavy in his pocket, but today it would stay there. He had a different plan in mind. Running his hand over his clean-shaven face, Carter took a deep breath and checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. His dark blue button-down shirt and khaki pants were purposefully chosen, professional enough to blend in, but nothing that screamed law enforcement. At 42, the subtle gray at his temples added to his distinguished appearance, though the stress of recent years had contributed to those silver strands. First day, fresh start, he muttered to himself, a habit he picked up from his grandmother. She had always taught him to speak his intentions into existence. Today's intention was simple: observe, understand, and then lead. He'd seen too many new commanders march in with guns blazing, full of big plans, and zero understanding of the department they were about to lead. Carter grabbed his worn leather messenger bag from the passenger seat and pulled out a small notebook. The pages were filled with his neat handwriting, notes about the 15th Precinct's history, statistics, and personnel files he'd studied over the past week. The department had a solid clearance rate, but a troubled history with community relations. That's why they'd brought him in. His track record of building bridges between police and communities in Chicago had caught their attention. As he flipped through his notes, a patrol car screeched into the parking lot, music blaring loudly enough to be heard through closed windows. Two officers stepped out, laughing and talking about their weekend plans, completely oblivious to the impression they were making. Carter jotted down the car number, not to get them in trouble, but to understand the day-to-day culture he was walking into. The precinct building itself was a mix of old and new, classic brick architecture with modern security upgrades. Carter watched as officers and civilian staff made their way inside, noting their interactions, their body language, the small groups that formed and dissolved. Some walked with the confident stride of veterans, others with the eager energy of rookies. But what caught his attention most was what he wasn't seeing. There seemed to be very little interaction between the officers and the civilians passing by on the street. He pulled out his phone and checked the time, 8:47 a.m. The morning briefing would be starting soon, and he knew most of the day shift would be inside. That's when he'd get his first real look at the department dynamics. His plan was simple: sit in the back, be just another face in the crowd, and watch. People acted differently when they thought the boss was watching. He wanted to see the real precinct, not the polished version they'd present to a new captain. A knock on his car window suddenly interrupted his thoughts. Carter turned, expecting to see a curious security guard, or maybe one of the senior officers who'd recognized him from his file photo. Instead, he found himself staring into the stern face of Officer Reynolds, whose reputation for being heavy-handed had made it all the way to Carter's briefing packet. The officer's hand was already resting on his holster, a detail that didn't escape Carter's notice. Something in Reynolds' stance, in the way his jaw was set and his eyes narrowed, told Carter that this impromptu meeting wasn't going to be a friendly welcome to Los Angeles. He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, years of experience telling him that this moment would define far more than just his first day on the job. As Reynolds aggressively motioned for him to step out of the car, Carter felt his grandmother's words echo in his mind. Sometimes the best lessons come wrapped in the hottest moments. Little did Officer Reynolds know, he was about to become part of a pivotal moment that would reshape the entire precinct. Carter took one last deep breath, his hand moving toward the door handle. The real test of leadership was about to begin. Step out of the vehicle. Officer Reynolds' voice carried across the parking lot, sharp and demanding. Carter noticed how several officers nearby paused to watch, their morning routines suddenly interrupted by the commotion. He kept his movements slow and deliberate as he opened the car door. "Is there a problem, officer?" Carter asked calmly, his hands still clearly visible. The morning sun felt warm on his face, but Reynolds' cold stare sent a different kind of chill through the air. The officer's body language screamed aggression, feet planted wide, hands still resting on his holster, chin jutted forward like a boxer ready to strike. "You've been sitting here for 20 minutes watching the station," Reynolds barked, taking a step closer. The smell of coffee and mint gum mixed with tension. "This is a restricted area. Let's see some ID. Carter could have ended this right there. His captain's badge felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. But years of experience had taught him valuable lessons about people's true colors. My ID is in my bag, he said, gesturing slowly toward the passenger seat. Would you like me to get it? Reynolds' response was to grab Carter's arm roughly, spinning him around to face the car. Hands on the vehicle. You think you can case our station, huh? Planning something? The officer's voice carried a hint of something darker than just professional suspicion. The sound of approaching footsteps told Carter that they now had an audience. He caught glimpses of uniform blues in his peripheral vision, faces he'd studied in personnel files now watching this scene unfold. No one stepped forward to intervene. That told him everything he needed to know about the precinct's culture. Officer, I'm only going to say this once. Carter kept his voice steady, despite Reynolds' grip tightening on his arm. You're making a serious mistake. I suggest you step back and allow me to show you my identification. A small crowd had gathered now. Carter spotted the two officers he'd seen earlier, the ones with the loud music, whispering to each other. A young desk sergeant stood frozen halfway between the station door and the scene, coffee cup forgotten in his hand. Everyone was watching, but no one was acting. Reynolds responded by roughly patting down Carter's pockets. Oh, you're giving me suggestions now. His hand found the hard edge of something in Carter's pocket. What's this? Weapon? Before Carter could respond, Reynolds yanked the object out and found himself holding a gold captain's badge. The morning sunlight caught the metal, making it gleam like a spotlight on the officer's suddenly pale face. That, Carter said into the deafening silence that followed, is my badge. I'm Captain James Carter, your new commanding officer. And this incident isn't ending the way you think it is. Reynolds stumbled backward as if the badge had burnt him. The whispers around them turned into a chorus of sharp inhales and muttered curses. The coffee cup the sergeant was holding slipped from his fingers, splattering across the asphalt like an exclamation point to the moment. I didn't. Reynolds started to stammer, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew. But Carter held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Save it, Carter said, straightening his shirt. His eyes swept across the gathered crowd, meeting each gaze directly. Everyone inside. Now, we're having an emergency department meeting in 10 minutes. His voice carried the weight of 15 years of command experience. Officer Reynolds, you'll wait in my office. We have a lot to discuss about proper procedure and the dangers of assumptions. As the crowd quickly dispersed, Carter bent down to pick up his messenger bag, which had fallen during the confrontation. Inside were all the reform plans he carefully prepared for the precinct. Now he knew exactly where to start. The 15th precinct was about to learn some hard lessons about justice, respect, and accountability. Lessons that were clearly long overdue. The walk into the precinct felt like crossing a minefield of stares and whispers. Carter kept his pace steady, his badge now pinned properly to his belt, while Officer Reynolds trailed behind him like a scolded child. The morning's events had shattered the usual buzz of station activity, replacing it with an uncomfortable silence that seemed to follow them through the halls. At the front desk, a dispatcher was already spreading the word through hurried phone calls and hushed conversations. Yes, that was him. No, Reynolds didn't know. Yes, the new captain. The words bounced off the walls, spreading the story faster than any official announcement could have. Carter paused at the door marked Captain's Office, which still bore his predecessor's name. He turned to Reynolds, whose face had gone from pale to slightly green. Wait here, he said, pointing to a chair outside the office. I need to address everyone first. The briefing room was packed by the time Carter walked in. Officers who weren't even on duty had somehow materialized, drawn by the rapidly spreading news. The usual chatter died as he entered, replaced by the sound of shifting feet and creaking chairs. Every eye in the room tracked his movement to the podium. He took his time arranging his notes, letting the tension build. Years of experience had taught him that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. He could see the morning shift officers who had witnessed the parking lot incident whispering to their colleagues, pointing out details with quick gestures and worried looks. Good morning, Carter finally spoke, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. This isn't exactly how I planned to introduce myself, but sometimes life has other plans. A few nervous chuckles broke the tension, quickly silenced by his serious expression. "I'm Captain James Carter, and what happened in the parking lot this morning is exactly why I'm here." He stepped out from behind the podium, preferring to stand closer to his officers. "I spent 20 minutes watching this station this morning. I saw officers arrive late, blasting music in their patrol cars. I saw civilians trying to ask for directions, being completely ignored. And then, I saw an officer escalate a situation without cause, using excessive force and inappropriate language. The room stayed silent, but he could see the impact of his words in their faces, some ashamed, others defensive, a few nodding in recognition of long-standing problems. But what concerns me most," he continued, "is what I didn't see. I didn't see anyone step forward to stop an obvious abuse of power. I didn't see anyone question clearly inappropriate behavior. Instead, I saw what happens when good people decide to look the other way." He pulled out his notebook, the one filled with his observations. "This precinct has one of the highest arrest rates in the city, but it also has one of the lowest community trust ratings. Today showed me why." He let that sink in for a moment. "Starting tomorrow, we're implementing new training protocols. Every officer will go through de-escalation training again. We're establishing a community oversight committee, and there will be zero tolerance for the kind of behavior I experienced today." A hand went up in the back. An older officer, his sergeant's stripes worn and faded, stood up. "Sir, with all due respect, we've heard this kind of talk before. New captain comes in, wants to shake things up. But out there, in the real world..." Carter cut him off with a raised hand. "The real world is exactly what I'm talking about, Sergeant. The real world is where people in our community don't feel safe around the very people sworn to protect them. The real world is where good officers stay quiet while bad behavior goes unchecked. That changes now." He could see his words landing, see the mix of resistance and recognition in their faces. Some officers sat straighter, while others seemed to shrink in their seats. "I'm not here to be your friend," Carter concluded. "I'm here to make this precinct what it should be, a place where justice and protection mean the same thing for everyone, regardless of who they are or what they look like." Looking at his watch, he made his final point. "You're all dismissed, except for the morning shift who witnessed the incident. We're going to have a detailed discussion about duty to intervene. And someone send Officer Reynolds in. It's time we had our chat." As the room began to clear, Carter could already feel the shifts beginning, small ripples that would soon become waves of change. The real work was just beginning. Officer Reynolds sat in the captain's office, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy that made him fidget with his badge. Through the window blinds, he could see other officers passing by, some avoiding eye contact, while others stared with a mix of pity and curiosity. The morning's events had turned him from a respected veteran into a cautionary tale in less than an hour. Captain Carter entered the office, closing the door with a quiet click that somehow seemed louder than a slam. He took his time settling into his chair, organizing some papers on the desk that still smelled of the previous captain's cigars. The silence stretched between them like a rubber band ready to snap. 15 years, Carter finally said, his voice calm but firm. "That's how long I've been in law enforcement. In those 15 years, I've been pulled over 37 times while off duty. I've been asked to step out of my car 23 times. I've had guns drawn on me twice, all before anyone bothered to check my ID." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Reynolds. "So tell me, what made you approach my car this morning?" Reynolds swallowed hard, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. "Sir, I was following protocol." "An unknown vehicle in a restricted area. Don't." Carter held up his hand. "Don't hide behind protocol. We both know there were 3 other civilian cars in that lot this morning. You didn't approach any of them. Let's try honesty instead." The wall clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Outside, the normal sounds of the precinct continued, phones ringing, doors opening and closing, the constant hum of police work. But in this office, time seemed to stand still. "I saw you watching the station," Reynolds finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were taking notes. With everything going on these days, I thought." He trailed off, realizing how weak his excuses sounded. "You thought what?" Carter pressed. "That someone would case a police station in broad daylight. Or did you see something else that made you suspicious? He let the question hang in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Reynolds looked down at his hands, then back up at Carter. For the first time that morning, he really saw his new captain, not just his appearance, but the weight of experience in his eyes, the stories written in the lines of his face. I made assumptions, he admitted. I acted without thinking. I was wrong. Carter nodded slowly. That's a start, but admitting you're wrong isn't enough. Not anymore. He pulled out a folder from his desk. Your file shows 17 complaints in the past 5 years. 3 for excessive force, 5 for inappropriate conduct, 9 for racial bias. All dismissed or marked inconclusive. He closed the folder with a soft thud. That ends today. Reynolds straightened in his chair, preparing for the worst. Am I being fired? No. Carter replied, surprising them both. Firing you would be easy. It would make a statement, sure, but it wouldn't solve the real problem. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street below. Instead, you're going to help me change this precinct. Sir, starting tomorrow, you're assigned to community outreach. You'll work with local youth programs, attend community meetings, walk beats in neighborhoods you've only driven through before. You'll take every training course we offer, and then you'll help train others. Carter turned back to face him. And you'll do it all under my direct supervision. Reynolds blinked, confusion clear on his face. You want me to? I want you to become the kind of officer this community deserves, Carter finished. It won't be easy. Some days you'll probably wish I had fired you instead. But if you're willing to learn, to really change, this could be a turning point, not just for you, but for this whole department. Standing up slowly, Reynolds nodded. The weight of the morning, of years of unchecked behavior, seemed to settle on his shoulders. I understand, sir, and I'm sorry. About this morning. Don't be sorry, Carter replied, returning to his desk. Be better. Now go home, think about everything that happened today. Tomorrow, we start fresh. He picked up his phone, signaling the end of the conversation. And Officer Reynolds, don't make me regret giving you this chance. As Reynolds left the office, the other officers quickly pretended to be busy with their work. But everyone had seen something they'd never expected. A man walking out of the captain's office looking not defeated, but somehow taller, as if carrying a new purpose. The whispers started immediately, but this time they carried a different tone. Maybe, just maybe, things really were about to change. The emergency department meeting was set for 2 p.m., giving Captain Carter just enough time to prepare. He stood at his office window, watching officers file into the station's largest conference room. Some walked in with crossed arms and furrowed brows, others with curious expressions, all of them talking in hushed tones about the morning's events. The conference room buzzed with nervous energy when Carter walked in. He carried no files, no presentations, just his worn notebook and years of experience. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he took his place at the front of the room, waiting for the murmurs to die down naturally. I've been here exactly 6 hours, he began, his voice carrying to the back of the room. In that time, I've learned more about this precinct than any file could have told me. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. And I've got to say, I'm disappointed, but not surprised. A ripple of uncomfortable shifting went through the crowd. In the back, Officer Reynolds sat quietly, his usual spot among the veteran officers notably empty. Nobody wanted to sit too close to the morning's trouble. But here's what might surprise you, Carter continued. I'm not angry about what happened this morning. I'm grateful. That got their attention. Even the officers scrolling through their phones looked up. Because now we can stop pretending. Now we can deal with the real issues. He walked to a whiteboard and picked up a marker. Let's talk numbers. Last year, this precinct had 83 complaints filed against its officers. Anyone want to guess how many resulted in disciplinary action? He wrote a big 0 on the board. This isn't protection. This is privilege. An older detective in the front row cleared his throat. Sir, you have to understand, most of those complaints are bogus. People just trying to cause trouble. Like I was causing trouble in the parking lot this morning. Carter cut in smoothly. The detective fell silent. How many of you watched what happened? Raise your hands. About 20 hands went up slowly. Now, how many of you knew it was wrong but said nothing? The same hands stayed up, joined by a few more. Carter put down the marker and leaned against the desk at the front. Starting tomorrow, things change. Not because I say so, but because they have to. First change. Every complaint gets investigated properly. Second, we're installing body cameras that stay on during every interaction. Third, mandatory de-escalation training for everyone, including me. A young officer near the middle raised her hand. Even the desk staff. Especially the desk staff, Carter nodded. They're our first line of contact with the public, but that's just the beginning. Next week, we start community outreach programs. Real ones, not just photo ops. Officer Reynolds will be leading some of these initiatives, sharing what he's learning. The surprise in the room was palpable. Everyone had expected Reynolds to be fired or at least suspended. This was something new. I know what you're thinking, Carter continued. Another new captain, another set of reforms that'll fade away in a few months. But here's the difference. I'm not asking you to change because it's politically correct or because it looks good on paper. I'm asking you to change because what happened this morning happens every day to people who don't have a captain's badge to save them. He picked up his notebook, flipping to a fresh page. Right now, I want each of you to write down one thing, one real thing you've seen in this precinct that needs to change. No names, no dates, just the truth. These notes go directly to me, and next week, we tackle these issues one by one. Papers rustled as officers began writing. Some started immediately, as if they'd been waiting for this chance. Others hesitated, looking around before putting pen to paper. Change isn't comfortable, Carter said as they wrote. It's not supposed to be. But neither is that moment when you realize you've become what you swore to fight against. He watched as even the most resistant officers finally began writing. We're not just changing policies here. We're changing a culture. And that starts with honest conversations like this one. As the notes began making their way to the front, Carter could see the shift happening. It wasn't dramatic, no standing ovations or sudden revelations. But in the thoughtful faces and straightened shoulders, he saw the first seeds of real change taking root. The hard work was just beginning, but for the first time in years, it felt possible. The Internal Affairs investigator sat across from Captain Carter, her pen hovering over a blank notepad. The morning light filtered through the office blinds, casting striped shadows across the desk between them. 3 days had passed since the parking lot incident, and now the wheels of official procedure were turning. Let me get this straight, the investigator said, her gray suit crisp and professional. You want to file a formal complaint about the incident, but you're also recommending Officer Reynolds for the new community outreach program. She tapped her pen against the pad, clearly puzzled by this approach. Carter nodded, sliding a folder across the desk. The two aren't mutually exclusive. We need official documentation of what happened, but we also need to focus on real change, not just punishment. A knock on the door interrupted them. The desk sergeant poked his head in, looking uncomfortable. Sorry to interrupt, Captain, but there's a situation in the break room you should know about. The break room was divided into 2 clear camps when Carter arrived. On one side stood Officer Reynolds and a small group of younger officers. On the other, several veteran officers were pointing fingers and raising voices. The coffee pot between them had become an unintended boundary line. He's throwing us all under the bus, one of the older officers was saying, writing up reports about observed behaviors and systemic issues. Since when do we air our dirty laundry? Reynolds stood his ground, though his hands were shaking slightly. Since we decided to actually do our jobs right, he replied. The captain's making changes for a reason. The captain's been here 3 days, another veteran scoffed. What does he know about? The room fell silent as they noticed Carter in the doorway. Please don't let me interrupt, Carter said, walking to the coffee pot and calmly pouring himself a cup. Though I'd love to hear the end of that sentence. What doesn't your captain know? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Even the usual station noises seemed muted, as if the whole building was holding its breath. Look, Carter continued, taking a sip of coffee, I get it. Change is hard. It's easier to stick with what we know, even when we know it's wrong. But right now, Officer Reynolds is showing more courage than anyone else in this room. He set his cup down and looked each officer in the eye. The Internal Affairs investigator is in my office right now. I could send her home. We could handle this internally like always. Sweep it under the rug. Maybe write up a nice memo about improved training and call it a day. He paused, letting that sink in. But then nothing changes, and the next time one of our officers makes a bad call, maybe someone gets hurt, maybe someone dies, and that's on all of us. The older officer who'd been speaking shifted uncomfortably. We're just worried about morale, sir. All these new rules, the extra paperwork, the community meetings. Morale? Carter raised an eyebrow. Let's talk about morale. This morning, I watched 3 teenagers cross the street to avoid walking past our station. That's not just a morale problem, that's a failure of our entire mission. He picked up his coffee cup again. The investigation proceeds. The changes continue, and anyone who doesn't like it is welcome to submit their transfer request. I hear the county sheriff's office is hiring. He turned to leave, then stopped. Oh, and Officer Reynolds? Good work on those reports. Keep it up. As Carter walked back to his office, he could hear the break room conversation resume, but with a different tone. Change was happening, not in grand gestures, but in small moments like this. One officer standing up, others starting to listen, old ways of thinking beginning to crack. The internal affairs investigator was still waiting, her notepad now filled with preliminary notes. Everything okay? She asked, noting his expression. Getting there, Carter replied, settling back into his chair. Now, where were we? Right, let's talk about implementing these new accountability measures. Outside his office, the precinct continued its daily routine, but something was shifting. Like a ship changing course, the movement was slow, sometimes creaky, but undeniably happening. The real test would be making sure it stayed on this new heading. 2 weeks had passed since the parking lot incident, and the 15th precinct was starting to feel like a different place. The morning shift change brought a new energy as officers gathered for their briefing. The usual tired faces were more alert, more engaged, especially when Captain Carter walked in carrying a stack of papers. Morning, everyone, he said, setting the papers down on the podium. Before we get to today's assignments, I want to share something. He held up a letter. This came in yesterday from Mrs. Chen at the community center. Last week, Officer Reynolds helped her grandson who was being bullied at school. He didn't just take a report. He spent his lunch break teaching the boy some confidence-building exercises. Reynolds, sitting in the middle of the room, looked down at his notepad, but everyone could see the small smile on his face. It was a far cry from the angry officer who'd confronted Carter in the parking lot 2 weeks ago. That's what community policing looks like, Carter continued. Speaking of which, let's talk about our new initiatives. He started handing out the papers. These are the results from our first community feedback survey. Some of it's hard to read, but that's the point. We need to know where we stand to know how far we need to go. The room grew quiet as officers read through the comments. Some winced at particularly harsh feedback, others nodded in recognition of long-standing issues. A young officer raised her hand. Sir, this comment about response times in the East Side neighborhoods, they're right. We've been treating those calls differently. Her voice shook slightly, but she kept going. I never thought about it until the bias training last week, but now I can't stop seeing it. Carter nodded encouragingly. Recognition is the first step. Now, what are we going to do about it? The next 30 minutes turned into an impromptu problem-solving session. Officers who rarely spoke up were suddenly offering suggestions. The veteran sergeant who'd been most resistant to changes was drawing up new patrol routes to ensure more equal coverage. One more thing, Carter said as the meeting was wrapping up. The body cameras everyone's been complaining about. Yesterday they saved one of our officers from a false complaint. And they also showed us 2 instances where we need to do better. That's what accountability looks like. It protects everyone. After the briefing, Carter stopped by the front desk where a small group of officers was gathered. They weren't just hanging around like before. They were practicing different ways to greet people walking in, making the entrance feel more welcoming. The desk sergeant looked up from his computer. Captain, you should see this. Complaints are down 30% from last month. But here's the interesting part. Officer morale reports are up. Turns out doing the job right feels pretty good. Carter was about to respond when a commotion outside caught everyone's attention. Through the glass doors, they could see Officer Reynolds talking to a group of teenagers. Instead of the usual tense standoff such encounters often became, Reynolds was smiling, showing them something on his phone. "That's the basketball team from the community center," the sergeant explained. Reynolds has been coaching them twice a week. The kids actually wave to our patrols now instead of running away. Carter watched through the window as the teenagers said goodbye to Reynolds, each one giving him a fist bump before heading off. When Reynolds came inside, he was carrying himself differently, shoulders straight, head high, but not from arrogance this time. "Good work out there," Carter said as Reynolds passed by. "Thanks, Captain." Reynolds paused. "You know, my wife said something interesting last night. She said I'm sleeping better, not so angry all the time. Guess sometimes changing course isn't just about the job." As Reynolds walked away, Carter made a note in his ever-present notebook. The changes were taking hold, not just in procedures and policies, but in the hearts and minds of his officers. There was still a long way to go. Years of ingrained habits don't disappear in 2 weeks, but the foundation was being laid, one small victory at a time. The precinct phones kept ringing, officers kept coming and going, reports kept being filed, but something was different. The atmosphere had shifted from tension to purpose, from resistance to possibility. Real change, it turned out, didn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it came in quieter moments, in small choices, in the gradual realization that doing better wasn't just possible, it was happening. The disciplinary hearing room felt smaller than usual, its wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting creating an atmosphere of tense anticipation. Officer Reynolds sat at the long table, facing the 3-person review board. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his badge gleaming under the harsh lights, but his eyes showed the weight of the moment. Captain Carter sat to the side, watching as the head of Internal Affairs opened a thick folder. The past month had been a whirlwind of changes at the precinct, but this moment, this reckoning, couldn't be avoided. It was time to face the music. "Officer Reynolds," the senior investigator began, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "We're here to review the events of last month, specifically your conduct during the incident with Captain Carter. The evidence includes security footage, witness statements, and your own admission of misconduct. Do you understand why you're here?" Reynolds straightened in his chair. "Yes, ma'am. I do." His voice was steady, different from the defensive tone he might have used a month ago. "I'm here because I made choices that day that went against everything our badge stands for." The room shifted slightly. Nobody had expected such direct admission. Usually, these hearings involved hours of excuses and justifications. "Would you care to elaborate?" the investigator asked, leaning forward. Reynolds nodded, taking a deep breath. "I approached a civilian without cause. I escalated a situation that didn't need escalating. I let assumptions and prejudices guide my actions instead of proper procedure." He paused, looking directly at the board. "But more than that, I betrayed the trust this department puts in its officers. The trust our community puts in us." One of the board members, a veteran captain from another precinct, spoke up. "Your record shows a pattern of similar incidents. Why should we believe this time is different?" Instead of answering immediately, Reynolds reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. "This is my daily log from the past month. Every interaction, every call, every moment I felt those old habits trying to come back." He placed it on the table. "But it's also full of something else. Lessons learned, lives touched, community members who went from avoiding me to waving hello." He opened the notebook. "Last week, I helped an elderly woman who was scared to report a break-in because she didn't trust police. Yesterday, I talked a teenager out of making a terrible mistake because he actually trusted me enough to listen. These aren't just stories, they're proof that change is possible. That I can be better. That we all can." Captain Carter watched the board members exchange glances. This wasn't the typical disciplinary hearing script they were used to. These weren't the practiced words of someone just trying to save their job. The senior investigator cleared her throat. "Captain Carter, you were the victim of Officer Reynolds' misconduct. Yet your reports indicate support for his retention and rehabilitation. Would you care to explain your position?" Carter stood, straightening his jacket. "A month ago, Officer Reynolds showed us everything wrong with our department. But since then, he's shown us everything that can go right when we commit to real change." He gestured to the numerous community letters and reports on the table. These aren't just papers, they're proof of transformation, not just of one officer, but of an entire approach to policing. The room fell silent as the board members huddled together, whispered conversations floating across the room. Reynolds sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table waiting. Finally, the senior investigator spoke. "Officer Reynolds, your actions last month were serious enough to warrant termination." She paused, letting that sink in. However, your response to those actions, your commitment to change, your work in the community, and the substantial evidence of improvement presents us with a different option. She closed her folder deliberately. You'll be placed on 6 months probation, during which you'll continue your community outreach work and regular counseling sessions. You'll also help develop new training protocols based on your experience. This incident will remain in your file, not as a mark of shame, but as a testament to the possibility of change. Reynolds' shoulders relaxed slightly, but his expression remained serious. "Thank you for the opportunity. I won't let you down." As they left the hearing room, Carter caught up with Reynolds in the hallway. "How do you feel?" Reynolds looked at his captain, then through the window at the community he'd sworn to protect. "Grateful," he said finally, "and ready to keep doing the work." The afternoon sun streamed through the precinct windows, casting long shadows in the hallway. But for the first time in a long time, those shadows seemed to be lifting, making way for something new, something better. The disciplinary hearing room felt smaller than usual, its wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting creating an atmosphere of tense anticipation. Officer Reynolds sat at the long table, facing the 3-person review board. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his badge gleaming under the harsh lights, but his eyes showed the weight of the moment. Captain Carter sat to the side, watching as the head of Internal Affairs opened a thick folder. The past month had been a whirlwind of changes at the precinct, but this moment, this reckoning, couldn't be avoided. It was time to face the music. "Officer Reynolds," the senior investigator began, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "We're here to review the events of last month, specifically your conduct during the incident with Captain Carter. The evidence includes security footage, witness statements, and your own admission of misconduct. Do you understand why you're here?" Reynolds straightened in his chair. "Yes, ma'am. I do." His voice was steady, different from the defensive tone he might have used a month ago. "I'm here because I made choices that day that went against everything our badge stands for." The room shifted slightly. Nobody had expected such direct admission. Usually, these hearings involved hours of excuses and justifications. "Would you care to elaborate?" the investigator asked, leaning forward. Reynolds nodded, taking a deep breath. "I approached a civilian without cause. I escalated a situation that didn't need escalating. I let assumptions and prejudices guide my actions instead of proper procedure." He paused, looking directly at the board. "But more than that, I betrayed the trust this department puts in its officers, the trust our community puts in us." One of the board members, a veteran captain from another precinct, spoke up. "Your record shows a pattern of similar incidents. Why should we believe this time is different?" Instead of answering immediately, Reynolds reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. "This is my daily log from the past month. Every interaction, every call, every moment I felt those old habits trying to come back." He placed it on the table. "But it's also full of something else. Lessons learned, lives touched, community members who went from avoiding me to waving hello." He opened the notebook. "Last week, I helped an elderly woman who was scared to report a break-in because she didn't trust police. Yesterday, I talked a teenager out of making a terrible mistake because he actually trusted me enough to listen. These aren't just stories, they're proof that change is possible, that I can be better, that we all can." Captain Carter watched the board members exchange glances. This wasn't the typical disciplinary hearing script they were used to. These weren't the practiced words of someone just trying to save their job. The senior investigator cleared her throat. "Captain Carter, you were the victim of Officer Reynolds' misconduct. Yet your reports indicate support for his retention and rehabilitation. Would you care to explain your position?" Carter stood, straightening his jacket. "A month ago, Officer Reynolds showed us everything wrong with our department. But since then, he's shown us everything that can go right when we commit to real change." He gestured to the numerous community letters and reports on the table. These aren't just papers, they're proof of transformation, not just of one officer, but of an entire approach to policing. The room fell silent as the board members huddled together, whispered conversations floating across the room. Reynolds sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table waiting. Finally, the senior investigator spoke. "Officer Reynolds, your actions last month were serious enough to warrant termination." She paused, letting that sink in. "However, your response to those actions, your commitment to change, your work in the community, and the substantial evidence of improvement presents us with a different option." She closed her folder deliberately. "You'll be placed on 6 months probation, during which you'll continue your community outreach work and regular counseling sessions. You'll also help develop new training protocols based on your experience. This incident will remain in your file, not as a mark of shame, but as a testament to the possibility of change." Reynolds' shoulders relaxed slightly, but his expression remained serious. "Thank you for the opportunity. I won't let you down." As they left the hearing room, Carter caught up with Reynolds in the hallway. "How do you feel?" Reynolds looked at his captain, then through the window at the community he'd sworn to protect. "Grateful," he said finally, "and ready to keep doing the work." The afternoon sun streamed through the precinct windows, casting long shadows in the hallway. But for the first time in a long time, those shadows seemed to be lifting, making way for something new, something better. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning in the parking lot. The 15th precinct looked the same from the outside, same brick walls, same American flag fluttering in the breeze, but inside, everything had changed. Captain Carter stood at his office window, watching the morning shift arrive. Officers weren't just hurrying to their desks anymore, they were stopping to chat with community members, greeting the crossing guard who now felt comfortable enough to wave back, helping an elderly man navigate the front steps. A knock on his door drew his attention. Officer Reynolds entered, carrying a thick folder and wearing a smile that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. "The latest community feedback reports, sir, and something else you might want to see." Carter took the folder, but Reynolds pulled out a newspaper from under his arm. The headline read, "Local Precinct Sets New Standard for Community Policing." Below was a photo of Reynolds playing basketball with kids from the youth center, his police uniform replaced by a coach's whistle. "Page 3 is more interesting," Reynolds said, pointing to another article. "Crime rates down 30% in our district. But here's the real kicker, community trust ratings are up 70%. Carter nodded, scanning the statistics he already knew by heart. Numbers are good, but it's the stories behind them that matter. Like Mrs. Chen's grandson making the basketball team, or that corner store owner finally feeling safe enough to stay open late. Speaking of stories, Reynolds said, pulling out one more paper from his folder. "Remember that teenager I caught tagging the wall last month? Instead of booking him, we got him into the art program. Well, he just won first place in the city youth art contest." Carter smiled, remembering how different things would have gone 6 months ago. Any resistance from the old guard about these new approaches? "Not anymore," Reynolds chuckled. "Not since Officer Thompson's daughter told him she wants to be a police officer like the new kind, not the old kind." That hit home pretty hard. A commotion outside caught their attention. Through the window, they could see a group of officers gathering around a community bulletin board they'd installed last month. Local residents were pinning up thank you notes, event announcements, and photos of officers helping at community events. "Remember when people used to cross the street to avoid walking past our station?" Reynolds asked quietly. "Now they're bringing us coffee and telling us their kids' names." Carter picked up his worn notebook from the desk, the same one he'd been writing in that first morning. Its pages were now filled with 6 months of changes, challenges, and victories. "It's not perfect," he said, flipping through the pages. "We still have work to do. But it's real progress," Reynolds finished. "You know, my wife said something interesting last night. Our daughter asked her what I do for work, and for the first time, she didn't just say police officer. She said he helps people feel safe." A young officer poked her head in the door. "Sorry to interrupt, Captain, but the community council meeting is starting. They want to discuss expanding the youth mentorship program." Carter nodded, grabbing his jacket. "Coming. Reynolds, you're presenting the new training protocols, right?" "Yes, sir. Though I still think it's ironic that I'm teaching others about proper conduct." Reynolds smiled, shaking his head. Who better? Carter asked as they walked out. You've lived both sides of it. That's what makes the lesson stick. As they headed to the meeting room, they passed the spot where their confrontation had happened 6 months ago. The parking lot looked exactly the same, but the people walking through it were completely different. Not just in how they acted, but in how they saw themselves and their role in the community. The meeting room was packed. Officers, community leaders, local business owners, and residents all sitting together, not in separate groups like before. As Carter took his place at the podium, he saw Reynolds pull out his own notebook, ready to share his journey from being part of the problem to becoming part of the solution. Looking out at the faces before him, Carter realized that this was what real change looked like. Not just new policies or better statistics, but a fundamental shift in how people viewed each other and their shared community. The incident that could have ended careers had instead sparked a transformation that would impact generations to come. All right, Carter said, calling the meeting to order. Let's talk about where we go from here. And in the room full of nodding heads and ready smiles, he saw the future of policing taking shape, one changed heart at a time.